It lays the predicate and the foundation for the development of a weather satellite that will permit man to determine the world's cloud layer and ultimately to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control the world.
How bad is it? How dark is the horizon that we collectively face? Over a century and a half ago, Henry David Thoreau made a statement that is relentlessly echoed in my mind for the last 2 decades. Thoreau said this: "Thank God men cannot fly, lest they would lay waste to the sky as they have done to the earth." Thoreau's nightmare has long since been our reality. How much of all that is unfolding around us is directly connected to the ongoing atrocities in our skies? Our weather, our waters, our soils, and every breath we take are all tainted by the ongoing climate engineering assault. What is most likely to unfold once the geoengineering insanity is halted? And it will come to a halt, one way or another. The total cessation of decades-long climate intervention programs is called, quote, double catastrophe scenario. Stay tuned for an in-depth evaluation. Climate and environmental collapse will force the collapse of civilization and unbridled power structure desperation. Are our lives going to magically go back to, quote, normal, as long as we blindly accept and adhere to the dictates of those who currently control the narrative? What do you think? What do you really think? Is it rational to believe that those in power actually care about populations, even as the planet's life support systems are collapsing? Is it rational to believe that the controllers have any interest in telling us the truth about anything? Is it rational to believe that the corporate media is anything else but the propaganda arm of power structures? The power structure narratives being pumped out are ever more desperate and transparent. Has a cancer of corruption and criminality now fully metastasized throughout the halls of governments and industries all over the world? The rapidly accelerating collapse of Earth's life support systems has now made it impossible for, quote, business as usual to be maintained. Thus, the controllers have become more desperate than ever. For over a decade, geoengineeringwatch.org has desperately tried to sound the alarm about what was coming. And now it's here. Collapse and tyranny are kicking in the front door. The party's over. It's not coming back. Does that mean we should lay down and give up? This is a question that each of us must ask for ourselves and answer for ourselves. Along with that question, there is this to consider. If there is still any chance that our collective efforts can yet expose the truth on countless issues, and in doing so expose and halt the tidal wave of insanity, thus altering our current course, don't we have an obligation to try? Could we yet salvage any part of Earth's remaining life support systems so that some might make it through the gathering storm? If there is any chance, then the answer is yes. And if that is the answer, then aren't we all obligated to apply ourselves fully to this unprecedented fight for all that we hold dear? A fight to preserve the planet on which all of our lives completely depend. Such a journey begins with abandoning preconceptions, programming, and biases. It starts with honest investigation. It starts with an objective investigation of what is so and what is not. Mark Twain said this, quote, "If you don't read the newspapers, you're uninformed. If you do, you're misinformed." Twain also said this, "It seems to me that just in the same ratio that our newspapers increase, our morals decay." Question: how many in our societies are now morally bankrupt? How many in corporations and governmental agencies, which are now one and the same, are also morally bankrupt? How many in corporate media? How many in the halls of government, in the halls of academia? Not just our own government and our own science agencies, but all governments and academia all over the world. How many are actually telling the truth? How many are actually disclosing to populations what is really unfolding and who is behind it? The most lethal epidemic we collectively face is an epidemic of moral bankruptcy. How many in our individual circles are either actively or passively supporting the establishment matrix of state-sponsored criminality, chaos, and carnage? The three-ring circus of total insanity that we are all drowning in could never have happened and cannot continue without the active or passive support of the majority population. Collectively speaking, the human race has long since taken the headlong leap into a bottomless abyss. Those that still don't see it, or who choose not to believe it, will, very soon, no longer have the option of denial. The choice to focus on thinking happy thoughts is not optimism. It's not a strategy for survival, and it's not a hallmark of courage or virtue. If we believe we are here for a reason, we must summon the strength to rise to the occasion at hand. Consider how rapidly our former reality has unraveled. Now stop and consider that the unfolding climate and environmental collapse is occurring at an even faster pace. Though the planet's life support systems won't completely implode overnight, the process is occurring at an incalculably rapid rate that is completely unprecedented in the entire span of Earth's 4.5 billion year history. All available paleo data confirms this. Extinction rates are currently in the realm of 15,000 times background rates and accelerating. But what could absolutely happen in the blink of an eye is the power structure playing cards that are capable of taking out the majority of global populations. For those who are still trying to convince themselves that the controllers would never do this, think again. Another reminder of this quote from the presidential advisor to a half-century of U.S. presidents, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who stated the following, quote, "Today it is easier to kill 1 million people than to control 1 million people," end quote. The complete decimation of the planet's life support systems to temporarily fuel industrialized, militarized civilization has now put us all on a path toward the near-term extinction of our species. That is the path we are on. Again, this question, will we take down the entire web of life with us? Is it yet possible to reach a critical mass of awareness that we may alter our current course before planetary omnicide is carved in stone? That remains to be known. What are a few harbinger examples of the ongoing insane behavior of the human race? The continued construction of nuclear weapons when there's already enough stockpiled to exterminate the human race thousands of times over. View the documentary, quote, Trinity and Beyond online, and then try to convince yourself that those who rule the world are not insane. The carpet bombing and napalming of Vietnam, decimating a country that did nothing to us. The U.S. military's apocalyptic setting ablaze of the Kuwait oil fields and then blaming it on Iraq. The factually undeniable inside job of 9/11. A false flag event used to galvanize the U.S. population into completely blind support of anything and everything the military-industrial complex wanted to do. An event that the vast majority of Americans still refuse to face, even though peer-reviewed science study has now proven World Trade Center 7, Building 7, was brought down by controlled demolitions. Let's take a moment to consider the hundreds of historically documented cases of the U.S. military conducting open-air biological experiments on innocent U.S. civilian populations. And please, don't believe me. Investigate before the internet is completely censored or shut down altogether. And for those who have chosen to pretend that internet anything is, quote, conspiracy theory or fringe, unless it's, of course, an official narrative on the internet, in which case they accept it. Unless it's an official conspiracy on the internet, in which case they accept it. Like the official conspiracy theory narrative of 9/11, The whole official narrative of 9/11 is a textbook conspiracy theory, but no one calls it that because it's the official narrative, so then it's okay. But the bottom line is the internet is the only way to reach the source, the horse's mouth, the original science studies, without being processed and filtered through the corporate media weapon of mass deception and distraction. So search while you can, learn while you can, lest you take your last breath in complete ignorance, having never taken part in this epic battle for the greater good on which everything depends. Don't wait till your last hour when you have no options left to rise to the occasion. If we don't act today, we won't have tomorrow. It's that simple. There is also the ongoing and accelerating complete contamination of our atmosphere and our environment to contemplate. A willful contamination facilitated by those in power. A systemic contamination of our soils, waters, foods, every breath we take. The list goes on and on. I want to take a moment to elaborate on an example report that won't likely be around for much longer, regarding the intentional demolition of and ignition of some 650 oil wells in Kuwait by U.S. Special Forces, which created an environmental apocalypse on an unimaginable scale. You have to see these videos to comprehend the totality of what was done there. And I'm only giving one example of an act of our government and our military to facilitate their agenda. A verifiable act that the American public is still in the dark about. I most sincerely hope that many will take the time to view this film footage, which is still available online, at least for the moment, and you will be shocked to the marrow. Here's the report headline on this subject. U.S. Special Forces memo admits U.S. and UN set Kuwaiti oil fires in 1991. From the report, the American Gulf War Veterans Association has received numerous reports from veterans stating that the U.S. forces, including Navy SEALs, Marine Force Recon, and Delta Force, were responsible for the setting of the oil well fires at the end of the Gulf War, 650 of them. Veterans have stepped forward and given detailed accounts of how Special Forces teams operated behind enemy lines and ahead of U.S. forces, setting explosives and incendiary charges on the wellheads. And then these forces remained hidden until the charges were remotely detonated and U.S. forces advanced beyond their position. Please bear with me for another few moments on this example of what those in power are actually about and what kinds of unimaginable atrocities they utilize our military for. Continuing from the report, a little-known fact about the Gulf War is that 1 month before the declaration of war on December 15, 1990, Secretary of State James Baker signed the U.S. Army report from the 352nd Civil Affairs Command on the, quote, new Kuwait, end quote. This document, by the way, is now unclassified and therefore available to those who are interested in reviewing it. Continuing, the report describes in detail how extensively Kuwait would be destroyed. It described how the oil wells will be set on fire, and then how Kuwait would be rebuilt, quote, better than before, end quote, with despotism rather than democracy, even more strongly entrenched than it had been before the assault. The report includes a list of U.S. corporations that were to be assigned the profitable task of rebuilding Kuwait and extinguishing the oil fires, as well as the Arab names that these companies and corporations would be operating under. Bechtel Power, a company I once worked for, was one of the primary corporate beneficiaries of this criminal tyranny. Again, if you've never seen film footage of the Kuwait oil well fire apocalypse, please search it and view it while you can, and contemplate who caused that and why they caused it. Even today, the official lie blaming Iraq for this environmental cataclysm persists. And for the record, historical data conclusively proves that the U.S. government all but invited Saddam Hussein to invade Kuwait. His doing so was necessary to facilitate the countless power structure agendas and objectives, such as those mentioned a moment ago. And there's this footnote. Remember the official narrative that Iraqi soldiers took babies from incubators in Kuwaiti hospitals? Never happened. all theater, all long since has been proven to be well-scripted power structure propaganda that the vast majority of the U.S. population never took the time to actually objectively investigate. 10 years later, the same core power structure bought us 9/11 and blamed it on another scapegoat, the Arab nation of Saudi Arabia. The 9/11 false flag assault was a very successful operation for those in power. It galvanized the U.S. population into completely blind support for and obedience to the military-industrial complex. Yes, Saddam and the Saudi rulers are all tyrants, but they are tyrants that were and still are embraced by the core of U.S. hegemonic power. Are other nations and global power centers tyrannical? Of course. But how does that excuse the ongoing chaos and carnage being wrought by what is by far the largest power center on the planet, the Western military-industrial complex? And for the record, again, on so many issues, from climate engineering to the current CV-19 scenario, global powers are colluding and cooperating on their agendas and objectives behind the curtain. If all available frontline data is objectively examined, such a conclusion is unavoidable and irrefutable. Where do we go from here? In a moment, the most recent breaking frontline reports on issues and events that will most impact our collective futures. First, I'm always compelled to thank each and every individual that is doing their best to stay informed, to wake others with credible data from a credible source, and to help turn the tide of insanity. Thank you for your help with sounding the alarm, more than I can ever say or convey. It is our collective efforts that can yet make a difference. This is Dane Wigington. You're listening to the Global Alert News Hour, episode number 259, July 25th, 2020. In this broadcast, news that covers the issues we must face if we're to have any chance of changing course. This commercial-free frontline news broadcast is brought to you by geoengineeringwatch.org and paid for by geoengineeringwatch.org. This news hour is broadcast throughout Northern California on 1670 AM, 104.9 FM, and 105.7 FM, Saturday mornings from 6 to 7 a.m., Sunday mornings, same time slot, repeat broadcast. Also, the PRN radio network on the East Coast rebroadcasts this news hour Wednesdays, 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Several other stations in the nation have picked up the broadcast as well. We make it available to any who are willing to put it up. We absolutely do not charge for this. We will help facilitate the uploads of this for those stations. We simply want to sound the alarm while it can still make a difference. Recordings of this broadcast can also be found at geoengineeringwatch.org under the recent top stories and radio sections. The latest geoengineeringwatch.org awareness-raising materials can be ordered from the homepage of geoengineeringwatch.org for our approximate cost of producing and shipping. If you're here in the Reading area, free geoengineeringwatch.org materials are available at Orchard Nutrition. Check with the staff in the vitamin section. I just left 25 free commercial DVDs of the jaw-dropping documentary from 9/11 Architects and Engineers for Truth. Irrefutable science evidence from over 3,000 of the world's top architects, engineers, and demolition experts. Science evidence that proves World Trade Tower 7 was brought down by controlled demolitions. Pick up your free DVD at Orchard and Geoengineering Watch materials. Moving on, a few headlines of power structure desperation to consider. A few more headlines, I should say. Quote, is America up for a naval war with China? Stop for a moment and consider the countries our country demonizes, like Iran, about their so-called aggression. Iran, a country that has invaded no one for some 230 years. In the last 100 years, the U.S. and its military have invaded and or occupied nearly 100 nations. Who's the aggressor? And as climate and biosphere collapse accelerates, as Geoengineering Watch has stated on the record for over a decade, power structure desperation will go exponential. That can manifest in the forms of, as we have stated for a decade, global conflict, false flag events, or pathogen release. Take your pick. Another headline, Israel hoping to start a war with Iran before U.S. elections. Many potential agendas and objectives there. Saudi coalition attack on Yemen wedding party leaves over 30 civilians dead. We don't hear much about that in the U.S., do we? We don't hear anything about it. 30 civilians at a wedding party. Can you even imagine if any of the countries the U.S. demonizes did that, they would be turned into a crater overnight. But it's okay for our allies to do it, especially our allies that have oil, which we need to fuel the military-industrial complex. They routinely obliterate civilians, and we hear nothing about it. Nothing. And why don't we hear anything? Let's consider this next headline. Newsroom job cuts up 170% through June, worst on record. The controllers don't need or want any actual journalists. The criminal corporate media complex has one primary task at this point: to pump out the official propaganda the power structure provides it. Corporate media is nothing less than a weapon of mass deception, and all those that are a part of the corporate media cover-up of power structure criminality should be, must be, considered accomplices to the crimes. More recent headline reports to consider. Quote, coronavirus. Fishermen test positive despite spending 35 days at sea and testing negative before they left. The report states the hospital's head of infectious diseases, Leonardo Bollatore, told journalists that he believed this is a, quote, case that escapes all description in publications. All 61 sailors aboard the trawler tested negative for the virus upon departure from Buenos Aires in late May. They were then flown to a jumping-off point for Antarctic voyages, where they were quarantined in a hotel for another 2 weeks before setting sail. And yet all these sailors ended up with the virus by the time they got back from a fishing expedition in Antarctica? How does that happen exactly? Here's another CV19 breaking headline to consider. California reports record daily increase in coronavirus cases as it becomes worst hit state in the U.S., Newsom says. Mr. Newsom, a power structure puppet, now a passenger on the sinking ship with the rest of us. When I met with Gavin and his top aide at the state capitol now several years past, it was clear to me that he was well aware of the ongoing climate engineering operations, but not about to address the issue, not about to jeopardize his membership in the club. In regard to the CV19 issue, we're told now officially that many states are setting new records for infections. Yes, the CV19 fires continue to be stoked. This headline: Fauci says he wears a mask as a, quote, symbol of good behavior. That's from Politico.com and other sources. This is not new, but it needs to be heard again. Dr. Anthony Fauci, the nation's top infectious disease expert, revealed, this is not long ago, this was only in May, that he wears a mask while in public partly as a, quote, symbol. And there's this related headline to consider. Fauci to throw out first pitch for National Baseball's opening day, a propagandistic display of forced conformity. What else has Dr. Fauci had to say about face masks? The following statement from Dr. Fauci's own mouth was recorded on 60 Minutes. Listen carefully.
United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
You're sure of it? Because people are listening really closely to this.
Right now, people should not be walking. There's no reason to be walking around with a mask. When you're in the middle of an outbreak, wearing a mask might make people feel a little bit better, and it might even block a droplet, but it's not providing the perfect protection that people think that it is. And often, there are unintended consequences. People keep fiddling with the mask, and they keep touching their face.
Dr. Fauci's own words. And let's not forget what Dr. Fauci said on film and on the record in 2017, that there would be, quote, a surprise pandemic during this presidency. And let's not forget Dr. Fauci's close association with Bill Gates, who has a close association with the world's most recognized geoengineer, Dr. Ken Caldera, who actually works for Bill Gates at this point. All is connected, and all those involved with the insanity are connected. Let's add this headline from last week. Fox News and other sources. Fauci urges governments to be, quote, as forceful as possible on mask rules. Seems something has changed. Let's ask this question now. How many have stopped to consider that as mandatory mask wearing has been implemented, the official infection rates seem to have gone through the roof in many regions. In Shasta County, California, for example, the official CV-19 infection rate has escalated almost 1,000% since the mandatory mask implementation. Why is that? Dr. Anthony Fauci, again, has inarguably maintained close long-term ties with Bill Gates. Consider this recent report, quote, Bill Gates warns that multiple doses of any coronavirus vaccine may be necessary. Schools could be closed until fall of 2021. Gates also stated, quote, serious mistakes were made, end quote, by the U.S. with the handling of the CV-19 scenario. Now this question, were they mistakes or part of the plan? You decide. And while doing so, please remember all that we know about Bill Gates and his decades-long push for reducing global populations and the coronavirus pandemic, quote, drill that was conducted by Gates immediately prior to the real coronavirus pandemic becoming known. On the issue of a vaccination and a vaccine, Gates said he had faith in the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, finding a, quote, safe and reliable vaccine. But Gates warned that it would take, quote, unbelievably big numbers, end quote, of doses to wipe the virus out. He further said, quote, none of the vaccines at this point appear like they'll work with a single dose, end quote. Let's stop and consider all this. So-called safe vaccinations from the pharmaceutical industrial complex. If this was so, then why was the medical industrial complex given total blanket immunity for any and all injury and death they cause? Why? Big Pharma has enjoyed this total legal immunity since 1986. Yes, just blindly trust the, quote, experts, as you are told. The experts that are paid for by Big Pharma in this case. Don't question, and certainly don't actually investigate what you're not being told. If you think the up-and-coming CV-19 vaccinations have been proven safe by any recognized science method, think again. For any that still believe legitimate safety testing has been conducted for the already being mass-produced CV-19 concoction, please post the evidence for the rest of us to review. Good luck on that. For those willing to conduct objective investigation, an investigation of the available facts, please view the recent live vaccine debate between Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and attorney Alan Dershowitz, a close ally of the current administration. Dershowitz has stated on the record that the U.S. government has the right to force vaccinate the population. Search, quote, heated vaccine debate, Kennedy versus Dershowitz. See for yourself the parade of verifiable facts presented by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as Kennedy obliterates the special interest rhetoric of an establishment minion. The Kennedy family has long since been, and thankfully continues to be, a thorn in the side of the establishment tyranny that masquerades as the U.S. government. My deepest regard and respect to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. On the subject of immunity for all those who carry out the official dictates, legal immunity I'm speaking about, for all those who toe the line for the power structure. This new report, Senate GOP seeks COVID-19 liability protections for schools and businesses. The report states personal injury protections would apply to schools, colleges, charities, churches, government agencies, and businesses. Now, if we look at how our government has controlled so many of these institutions, certainly the money comes from the top, from those who manufacture money from thin air. They control everything, including militaries, thus they control countries and everything in those countries. They fund colleges, churches. This is the protection of environmental organizations as well, and churches with their 501 nonprofits. The 501 is the tool by which these institutions are controlled. And I'm very grateful and thankful to some, like Dr. Chuck Baldwin, who have spoken out very clearly, very directly, very repeatedly about the tyranny that goes along with the 501 nonprofit, a tyranny that has turned in Chuck's words, the former protectors, i.e. physicians and pastures, has turned them into predators. I'll be conducting an interview with Dr. Baldwin at the end of this month. We'll try to get that posted as soon as we can. But I can only hope that more so-called spiritual leaders re-examine what they claim to believe, what they claim to have faith in, and ask themselves, what part in the play are they actually carrying out themselves? Changing gears to the bottom line of biosphere collapse. Weather warfare operations continue unabated. Though nature is certainly capable of spawning increasingly extreme weather events on our superheating planet, at this point all weather events, large or small, are completely colored by the climate engineering onslaught. This headline from CNN from last week: Hurricane Douglas intensified into a major hurricane as it moves toward Hawaii. Though the weather makers are now also allowing or facilitating some cyclonic spin-up in the Gulf of Mexico, the climate engineers have, in recent years, kept any significant storms away from, in the Gulf of Mexico at least, oil infrastructure. The U.S. military has hurricane manipulation programs, has had them since at least 1947, Project Cirrus. To learn more, search geoengineeringwatch.org, hurricanes. See the animations that we recorded in real time as hurricane landfalls were taking place, like Hurricane Harvey. The animations they're actually a metering of the microwave radio frequency transmissions that were used to hold those storms in place so that they wrought the havoc that they inflicted in those regions. You have to see these animations to believe it. But these cyclones are absolutely, at minimum, being steered and directed and manipulated, at minimum. I'm not asking, and I've never asked anyone to believe anything I state on this news report. I'm asking you to investigate what is reported here. Investigate for yourself without preconceptions, bias, and programming. Clear the lens through which you see the world, that you may see the horizon clearly. From ecowatch.com, NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, warns of, quote, extraordinary increase in coastal flooding. The report states by 2030, NOAA projected that the frequency of high tide flooding could double or triple, according to the New York Times. By 2050, that number could be 15 times as great, with the typical coastal community flooding between 25 and 75 days a year. Good luck on that. On the current course, by 2050, mathematically speaking, on the current trajectory, using current calculations of current trends on countless data sets, we won't be here. And oceans certainly by that time, under any scenario, will likely be many meters higher, many meters. And yet we still have the could, may, might scenario to pacify populations until the brutal, bitter end, which will come with blinding fury and is ramping up by the day. It's not hard to see the ramping up of the insanity on our corporate media TV and the conditions being imposed on populations, and it is directly connected to the collapsing environments around us, collapsing climate, collapsing environments, all of which make the current paradigm no longer sustainable. Power structure knows it, and they are maneuvering as quickly as they possibly can. Sea level rise is and will increasingly be far worse than any official estimate. Earth's water bodies are also superheating and dying. Sea level rise is not just from the melting ice, it is also from thermal expansion. The heating alone further raises sea levels. From phys.org, climate change could, there we have those terms of pacification again, could make toxic algae blooms in our oceans more deadly. There's no could in that equation. It already has. It long since has. Here's an excerpt from the report. Quote, toxic algae blooms are increasingly poisoning marine animals. In fact, the entire ocean food chain is completely collapsing at this point from countless factors. But a primary factor, again, so many roads lead back to climate engineering destroying the ozone layer, more on that later in this broadcast, which releases intense UV radiation, which wipes out plankton. Plankton, the foundation of life on Earth, the primary source of production for oxygen on our planet. Bottom of the food chain. No plankton, no people. Very simple. And it goes up the chain from there. No trees, no people. No environment, no people. No ozone layer, no people. Again, more on that in a moment. Let's cover another headline on the weather warfare. Remember to consider that there can be no legitimate discussion of the climate without first and foremost addressing the ongoing climate engineering operations. This headline, China's Three Gorges Dam buckles as country battles floods. From that report, parts of central China are experiencing rain to rival the massive flooding in 1998, leaving around 1/3 of China's farming output at risk. Weather warfare. How many countries are pushing and pulling on the climate system until it completely disintegrates? And all of this scenario of what's happening in our skies is directly connected to everything we are having to endure on the ground. Everything being imposed on us by governments, what we're going through, everything is intertwined and intricately connected, and that must be considered and remembered. In regard to the flow of precipitation, the climate engineers control the spigot. With that in mind, flooding is creating increasing dangers with nuclear power facilities. On that note, this new headline, China to build 6 to 8 nuclear reactors a year from 2020 to 2025. Again, good luck. We'll see how far you get. And think of the human insanity. We have one reactor facility, Fukushima, that may be an extinction level event by itself. No known technology to fix it. 3 reactors in total meltdown. And we're building more. Not just China, but other countries. Welcome to life on planet Earth. A full-blown circus of total insanity until nothing is left. More headlines, but first consider this. Climate engineering fallout contains massive amounts of aluminum nanoparticulates. Peer-reviewed science study has proven that extreme aluminum contamination is killing bees, creating symptoms in bees that resemble Alzheimer's and dementias in humans. Look it up online. Search bees aluminum. Ask yourself why we're not being told about this. On that note, this new headline, about 94% of wild bee and native plant species networks lost. York study finds. We already know that global insect populations have completely collapsed. There's very little left, 80 to 90% decline. Geoengineering.org was the first major source to report this nearly a decade ago from our work with retired Forest Service scientists. The science community is now only admitting to it because they can't hide it any longer. And there's this new report, which the, quote, experts expect us to believe from the UK Guardian and other sources. Quote, it's not raining, just a 50-mile wide cloud of flying ants. Let's stop on that one for just a moment. 50 miles by 50 miles. What's that? 2,500 square miles? We're supposed to believe that a massive radar anomaly is over England, southeast England, is a 2,500-mile wide cloud of flying ants? Planetary asylum. We've been told this before, that it was ladybugs, 1,000 square miles of ladybugs and 2,000 or 3,000 square miles of dragonflies. Are there any photographs of any of this? Of course not. And yet when we have film footage, countless reels of film footage of jet aircraft, military tankers, and commercial, dispersing particulates into the atmosphere with nozzles visible turning on and off, none of that is acknowledged. When we see these aircraft literally blot out the entire sky, never acknowledged, but yet we're told it's 2,000 or 3,000 square mile clouds of insects, trillions and trillions that nobody seems to have a picture of, with the exception of a few close-up shots of ant colonies on the ground, as if that proves anything. We're swimming in a sea of insanity, all of us, and it's getting worse by the day, deeper by the day. How much worse is the planetary incineration becoming? This headline, 19 million hectares. That's 47 million acres of land scorched as wildfires continue to rage in Siberia. 47 million acres this year alone. From the report, major cities in Russia are covered in haze and smoke as mega wildfires continue to rage through Siberia. An area larger than Greece has been torched. Let's put this into perspective for those in Northern California. We're talking about an area over 200 times larger than the Carr Fire. And we hear nothing. Here in the U.S., nothing. In regard to the rapidly increasing, completely unprecedented fires occurring all over the world, climate engineering is the component that is most directly establishing the conditions that facilitate these fires. I'm not referring to the source of ignition. That's another issue entirely. But in regard to wildfires and their increasing connection to climate engineering, search Dane Wigington YouTube, Wildfires Serve Geoengineering Agenda. That will get you specifically to a 22-minute report that will highlight how climate engineering is connected to the wildfires and what component of climate engineering that the wildfire smoke serves. Also, check the Engineering Wildfires section on the homepage of geoengineeringwatch.org to learn much, much more. Will a blue ocean event occur this year in the Arctic? A BOE, a blue ocean event, is a scenario when the Arctic is, in essence, ice-free at the end of the summer melt season. Once this scenario takes place, the unfolding planetary meltdown and climate collapse goes completely exponential. Arctic ice extent, the surface area, and the volume are both far into record low territory and plummeting by the day. Those in power are well aware of all of this, and all of this is completely connected to everything that societies are currently enduring, everything that is being carried out, all connected to the background of climate and environmental collapse. On the other side of the world, new this week from multiple mainstream sources, methane is mysteriously leaking from the seafloor in Antarctica, edging global heating to a point of no return. From that report, researchers have for the first time discovered an active leak of methane gas from under Antarctica's seafloor. From that report, methane poses a huge climate risk. The report states vast amounts of methane are stored under sea ice. The researchers noted that Antarctica is estimated to contain as much as a quarter of Earth's marine methane. They stated, quote, the ultimate source of this methane remains unknown, end quote. Question, is this mantle methane, which is formed by geologic forces? And if so, does that call into question the official narrative of fossil fuels being, quote, fossil fuels? That's another story for another day. But the human race and its treating of the earth, our host, with unimaginable contempt, with the attempt to play God with the weather being at the top of the list, has this brought us to the end of the road? Has Gaia now had enough? Are we all very close to finding this out the hard way? The short answer is yes. And why, even now, are so many so compelled to continue pretending that infinite growth and infinite environmental decimation was never sustainable? As the proverb goes, there are none so blind as those who refuse to see. Our air is toxic. Our once brilliant clouds, often obscured in filth. Our soils and waters have been contaminated. How are we to survive for much longer on the current course? Climate engineering, climate collapse, power structure, desperation, the CV-19 pandemic, all are completely intertwined. The climate engineers control the flow of precipitation, of our rain. We know from constant observation of NASA satellite imagery that climate engineering operations are completely blocking any and all moisture to regions of Northern California. Though the objectives and agendas behind such climate engineering operations are debatable, the fact that they are occurring and creating the consequences cited is beyond debate. The covert cutting off of rain to any country, to any people, is nothing short of an act of war. What will we do when our wells go dry? What happens then? Will populations blame it on nature, as those in power are hoping? Or will they begin to look up and connect the dots? Will they stand up and make their voices heard to stand against the tidal wave of insanity that we are all drowning in, while there's still time to make a difference? Those in power view weather warfare in the same light as biological warfare. Both are crown jewel weapons of the military-industrial complex. Each of these weapons are capable of bringing any country or any population to their knees, while those that are under attack have absolutely no idea that a war is being waged against them. How bad is the ozone layer collapse scenario? Worse than any of us would like to believe. Last week I had an extensive communication with the former NASA contract engineer that has been metering surface UV radiation levels, UVA, UVB, and UVC for Geoengineeringwatch.org, with state-of-the-art equipment supplied to him by Geoengineeringwatch.org. UVB is now off the scale, and DNA-damaging UVC radiation is now present on the surface at even higher levels, and that's the last spectrum of UV radiation before X-ray, and we all know how bad that is. More than any other factor, climate engineering operations are at the core of the ozone layer destruction. At the current rate of destruction, the former NASA contract engineer calculates that total ozone layer collapse will occur later this decade. If that happens, all terrestrial life will soon perish, followed by most, if not all, aquatic life. Even if we, the human race, had no other challenges, which of course we do, they're countless, the collapse of the ozone layer is in and of itself an extinction level event. The damage done to Earth's miraculous life-supporting processes can't be undone in any time frame that matters. Are we already too late to save anything? Countless forms of human activity have been systematically destroying Earth's climate and environmental systems for thousands of years. And yes, the damage in the beginning of organized civilizations was slight and proceeded very slowly. But all along the way, the speed and degree of destruction increased. Fast forward to the present. The rate of destruction to Earth's natural systems is occurring at a rate that cannot truly be comprehended. Global climate engineering operations are the single most destructive factor in the equation, though again, far from the only factor. As each domino in the climate chain falls, it knocks over a larger domino, and the process continues. Once planetary heating and climate feedback loops have been triggered, they pick up speed as they begin to feed from their own processes. Thawing and releasing methane hydrate deposits from the Arctic and now Antarctica are prime examples of feedback loops, as the methane deposits thaw and release, often leaving behind massive bomb-like craters. Again, search Siberian methane craters. You'll be shocked at what you see. The methane migrates into the mid and upper troposphere, and there it traps the sun's incoming heat energy at an extraordinary rate, while further destroying the ozone layer. Climate engineering is making all of this worse. Over a 10-year time horizon, methane is well over 100 times more potent a greenhouse gas than CO2. As the planet heats further, yet more methane thaws and releases, trapping even more heat at Earth's surface. The feedback loop continues. And for the record, 50 or more feedback loops may already have been triggered. We can't yet know if these processes can be halted before a runaway greenhouse effect turns our formerly thriving planet into a true sister to Venus, aka Venus syndrome. Search Geoengineeringwatch.org Venus syndrome to learn more. So what happens when geoengineering is halted? Is the climate reset button magically activated? Does everything climate return as it was before 70 years of covert climate engineering operations were deployed? The unfortunate answer is no, not even close. Though no one can know the processes of backlash that will occur once planet Earth is finally freed from the death grip of the human race, available data leads to the likely scenario of a complete off-the-rails hydrological cycle as the planet attempts to find a new equilibrium, as the planet attempts to find a way to survive what the human race has inflicted, with climate engineering again being at the top of the list. The probable scenario cited hinges on the planet's cloud-forming mechanisms, i.e. plankton, living, breathing forests, etc. If those mechanisms are too far gone to facilitate adequate cloud formation, the story will end, at least for the foreseeable geologic future. Search Geoengineeringwatch.org double catastrophe scenario to learn more. But this is the bottom line. If we're to have any chance of preserving the ability of the planet to support life, we must completely and immediately halt all forms of human damage and interference to the natural processes. I fully realize the ramifications of what I just stated, but if any are to survive the converging catastrophes that are now closing in from every conceivable direction, it will be because of a complete and immediate course correction by the human race. I have no delusions about that statement either, but one should try to do one's part no matter how dark the horizon or how great the odds are against success. When I ponder the immensity of what we face, when I ponder the face value impossibility of success, I force myself to consider and remember that, mathematically speaking, it is a statistical impossibility for life to have ever occurred on our planet. Yet, against all odds, against reason and against logic, Earth thrived with life and diversity beyond any true comprehension. If the miracle that is life is given even the most minute and minuscule chance, life will find a way. As for what may be in this equation, in this battle with us and on our side, that's another story, one that we cannot yet know with certainty. I returned to the shores of the Pitt River last Sunday afternoon for a third time in as many weeks. I stayed through the night. Though the many hundreds of juvenile bullfrog sentries remained in their stoic positions along the shoreline, to my great dismay, they were now in peril. As I made my way along the shoreline with my light in hand, I was confronted with the heart-wrenching images of many still and lifeless bullfrogs, often completely upright, as if still alive, only feet from the water. This was extremely perplexing to me and deeply troubling. Though water temperatures were far higher than they have historically been for this body of water, and though the bullfrogs had very little available food in this location where I've never seen them before, the lifeless amphibians still had ample bodily mass when they succumbed. Why were so many dead, so near the water? My sleep that night on the forest floor was restless, and when I woke up the next morning, I set off back to the banks of the Pitt River. The dying had worsened. The UV radiation was extremely intense, even more than the now normal off-the-chart levels. I believe that this factor is the key component to the distressing scenario that I was observing. I assessed my options. Did I have the necessary gear with me to initiate a rescue mission? Could I yet save at least some of my sentinel friends? I had to try, and I did. I removed boots, pants, and shirt, and with the netted bag I had in my pack, I made my way through the thick and far too warm mud along the bank. Over the course of the next hour plus, I was able to snatch up about 50 juvenile frogs, while seeing more and more still and dead individuals along the shoreline, upright, stoically perched on the shore only feet from the water. I reclothed, placed a bag of still surviving bullfrogs very carefully in my pack, and set off toward a primary pond on my habitat preserve, one that still contained cool water and abundant shoreline vegetation. Later that afternoon, I freed my rescued friends, and all but one survived the journey. I had to go back, and I did. I made the trip on each of the next 2 days, rescuing as many frogs as I could catch and carry in the time I had, many dozens. But on each of these next 2 trips, more of the frogs had fried on the shadeless shores where they had chosen to make their stand. My third trip back and attempt to save the frogs, I brought and did my best to use a GoPro camera. I'll do my best to post this video as soon as I can. I'll also attempt to record and post more of my solo treks into the wilderness. I put off all other commitments I had in order to return to the frogs earlier this week, and I've not been able to make the trek back in recent days due to other commitments. All the while, I know the relentless heat and UV are most certainly continuing to take their toll. My soul rages at the insanity in our skies, at the insanity that surrounds us, the insane, honorless, and morally bankrupt individuals who are actively or passively facilitating the matrix of planetary decimation and death. I will find a way to return to the frogs this weekend. I'll do all I can to save as many as I can. This is my duty. This is my obligation to the whole. So long as any creature, any tree, any part of the web of life struggles to survive, struggles to do their part for the greater good, I will do everything in my power to play my part. I will remain at my post no matter what comes. We must never yield to the gathering darkness, never. And if we stand as one, we may yet make a profound difference even at this late hour. Over 2,000 years now past, the Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius stated this, quote, "If any man can show me that I do not think or act correctly, I will gladly change. For I seek truth, by which no man was ever injured. But he is injured who abides in his error and ignorance." Since I was 14 years old, these words have echoed through my mind. Waking the sleeping populations to all that is unfolding is the only way forward in this fight. Share credible data from a credible source. Check the activists' suggestions section on the homepage of geoengineeringwatch.org to learn more about how you can help to sound the alarm. Make your voice heard. Make every day count. Time is not on our side. Until next week, this is Dane Wigington with geoengineeringwatch.org.